This is Lead Time.
Welcome to Lead Time. Tim Allman here with Jack Kalberg. It's a joy to have you, listener, with us today as we get to have round two with our very own, this is the way he refers to himself on his website and on his emails, an LCMS layperson and demographer. Yes, we have the one and only Lyman Stone hanging with us today. Round two with him, who just recently conducted, many of you may have seen this, the Lutheran Religious Life Survey. And the survey was open to anyone. Hopefully you saw it, were able to take part in it as I was. But the results of this survey only reflect those who are LCMS members who gave their feedback. So before we get into the data, Lyman, how you doing, brother? Thanks for hanging out with us.
I'm doing very well. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, man. All right. So let's just jump right in. Give us the background. For those who missed the first podcast, I'd encourage you to go back and listen, but just kind of your driving why around doing such a survey. Tell us that, Lyman.
Yeah. So I'm a demographer. I study population, what factors change population, what causes groups to shrink or grow. That's my vocation. And a number of years ago, I thought to myself, wouldn't it be great if I could use this vocation in a way that's more directly beneficial to our church, to a church body that I love, and am raising my children in. And so I started trying to see if there was anything useful I could do. And that led to a range of kind of demographic estimates for the LCMS that I kind of thought, well, what can I do with those? Can I just say, here's some numbers on the LCMS? Hey, didn't seem like that would be highly useful or impactful. So my PhD is actually in survey methodology. So like how to design surveys. And so I thought, well, I'll run a survey of LCMS members. It's not that big a group. It ended up being a bit more complicated of a project than initially anticipated. But that was in 2021 that the first survey ran. It ran again in 2022. It ran again in 2023. And later in late summer, early fall of this year, it'll go out again. Each wave has been a little bit different, but the idea was just to ask questions that, frankly, to ask questions that I hear asked. I hear pastors saying, well, how many people are using DS4 or something? I don't know. Or something we'll talk about it's really bad to do communion this way or this way. But then we have no idea, well, who does it that way? So there's a lot of things that could be asked. And so I rotate the questions a bit, and the questions are definitely oversampled on things that I think are interesting for my sort of sociologically informed research. But I try to also stock it with questions that I think are of more general synodical interest as well. And so there's a lot of questions in there. So each year I kind of focus on a different set of questions and kind of say, here's some takeaways from those questions. And this year, as I'm sure we're going to get into, there was a big focus on converts. So conversion to the LCMS.
Interesting.
And it is very interesting.
Yeah.
So tell us how the survey was conducted. And if you want to get into how your question, I love your transparency on survey method, et cetera, regarding, hey, I hear different things and I'm going to change up the questions. So conversion was a big deal. I'm guessing that's because you see, like we see the LCMS, like many mainline denominations, shrinking. So are we having a higher emphasis on bringing not just, we need to have more babies to be sure, but also adult converts in? And what are the environments, the congregations that are having some success toward that end? I'd love to go deeper into how it was conducted and how your questions have kind of evolved.
Yeah. So the method hasn't changed a lot since the first survey wave, which is basically I scrape every email address off the LCMS website. So every pastor, every rostered everybody on the roster, and also all the church email addresses, the district email addresses. And I blast an email out that says, here's a survey, please take it. And some people, their spam filters block it, and some people have unsubscribed. So it's not literally the case that every person, some people will, I get emails sometimes being like, well, I didn't receive it and I'm on the roster. Well, the email address that's associated with you on the roster is defunct, right? It's not been updated. Right. Okay. So I blast it out, and then I also circulate it on to LCMS Facebook groups. I circulate it on Twitter, on Discord, that all have appreciable LCMS communities. And then last year, I started producing like a short link that was more suitable for a church bulletin. So a couple churches did put it in their bulletin, and actually a few churches set up a computer in the narthex to help older people take the survey. Which I was like, wow, that's awesome. Now it also means I have a little bit of an analytic problem, because I know that there are like 5 or 6, for the most part, I'm getting like 1, 2, or 3 people from a given church. Okay. Mm-hmm. But then I know that I've got like 5 churches where I have like 25 people from those churches, and I can't see who's who actually. Yeah. Though I'm working on a way to, I want to guarantee people their privacy, and anonymity if they want to protect it. But I am looking for this next wave. I'm going to provide a way that churches can have a unique link. So like if a church wants to partner with the project and say, look, we're going to help you get respondents, and also we're just curious what our own people answer to this. Yeah. We can set up a unique link, and also we could slightly vary the questions. If a pastor's like, also, I'd love to know if people were upset about that voters meeting we just had, like we could ask that for their church specific. So I'm going to work on inviting churches to like partner more formally so that we get more complete samples of churches, and also we can put more information in the hands of like a pastor or a group of elders to, the idea being that, they would get an even more anonymized version of the data, right? Yeah. Just to protect people's, privacy, and not just privacy, but anonymity. I want it to be impossible for these people who give me their responses to ever be identified. Some people voluntarily provide identity.
I'm sorry, go ahead. I'm saying I could see it being really cool thing, like as a district trends, that the districts could maybe aggregate their data and see what's going on, Southwest versus right. Northeast.
So the idea is that I can produce essentially an infinite number of unique links, right? Mm-hmm. Now there will always be just a generic landing page for the survey for people who just, I want to take it, I don't care. But yeah, so the idea is we can do things like that. And the exciting part of that is that in the past, this survey has just been me. So like all the survey reports, basically they say somewhere in there, like no external funding was received for this report. What it amounts to is it's kind of a more oblique way of saying, if something's wrong in this, it's nobody's fault but mine. And also the couple of $1,000s it takes to run this each year just came from my pocket. Right? Nobody else was paying. But that is changing. So I'm in the process of working out an agreement with one of our Concordias to make a home for some of this research and make it more institutional. That's not all public yet, so I won't say more on which one. But no, I mean, it's useful for everybody. So, but I'm just looking for a place to make it more institutionally licit.
You don't have to give any kind of indicators.
I was going to say, I know our theme is... Go ahead, Tim.
Over under on Concordia, Nebraska. But I'm just my guess. That's my guess. Knowing Bernard Bull and his... anyway,
I can neither confirm nor deny.
Or deny. Exactly. Yeah. So, Jack, go ahead.
Yeah. So I know our theme here is to talk specifically about this survey, but surveys in general... we are really big on kind of being data informed with respect to, how effective are we being in ministry. So I know in the Christ Greenfield context and even the work that we do with the ULC, we are very intent about doing surveys, is the discipleship work that we're doing, are the worship services, all that kind of stuff. We are constantly sending out surveys to try and understand, like, how are we connecting with people? How are we impacting people? We do, Lyman, you're probably familiar with the Net Promoter Score, right? How likely would you be to recommend a particular brand to people, and using that as a tool for engagement. So I'm just really delighted that we've got sort of this activity happening where it's data informed. And then, like, the ultimate goal is how do you use that data to make decisions? What is the decision?
Well, and the challenge you have is like, so, I know I'm not the only person who, I'm not the only person or LCMS affiliated institution that is running surveys, but the challenge you get is you'll get like one district does a survey of something and then they get a result. And then as soon as they look at it, they're like, well, is that good or bad? Or is that high or low? And they don't have a comparison. There's not a benchmark. So my interest is benchmarking. I want to be able to develop figures that in the future, other people, as they are, if your church does like a follow-up survey with, recent confirmands or something, I don't know. And you get a certain answer, you could then go and look somewhere else and be like, well, what's typical in the LCMS? What's normal? So that's kind of a long run objective, is to be able to establish benchmarks so that we can just better understand. Because many of us, we have a view of our church and maybe of a few other churches that we sometimes visit because your parents go there or your sister goes there or whatever. And particularly for pastors, I think this is actually an even narrower field, because like lay people, we get in other churches on Sundays. Like we kind of float around a little bit, but like pastors, like you're in one place every Sunday. You actually have a really, really circumscribed vision of like what's happening. Now, you all have more connections between each other than lay people have across congregations, but pastor to pastor connections are very different than the experience of actually being in the pew, right? So my hope is that one of the things this can do is it can actually really be a tool to pastors to see just like typicality. And one of the things that I like to push back on is like let's say that we found that only 55% of LCMS churches commune weekly. Okay, let's say we found that. And that's not what we actually found. I think I actually find it's something like 85% commune weekly or something is my recollection. Because I asked about that in this recent wave. Though that's not in the survey report, as it would happen. There's all these questions that I ask about, but I don't have enough time to analyze it all. So I'm in the process of trying to acquire research assistants. But let's say we found there was 55% that were communing weekly. Would that tell us anything about how frequently communion should happen? No. Right. It would tell us absolutely nothing about that, right? Because you might say, well, that means 45% of people are doing it wrong. Or maybe you'd say that means 55% of people are doing it too much. Okay. It tells us what is happening. But I try to, I don't fully stay away from this, but I try to be clear that there does not always imply ought. There are times where is and ought are fundamentally and metaphysically tied. But there are many times when they're not, where we can say this just is what it is, and we can have a separate conversation about what ought to be. And I'm very well aware of the fact that my vocation is very strictly on the question of what is. Yeah. I'm not a pastor. I'm not a synodical official. I'm not trained in ecclesiology or anything like that. I have no authority. I'm not even like on the council of my local church. I'm just in the pew, trying to keep my children mostly docile. And if I'm lucky, maybe they'll participate for like part. So my vocation is what is. It's just documenting what is actually happening. The question of what should happen is often beyond what I'm the best witness to.
really
even
good.
even what the should is can be a little bit misleading, because you might find correlations, and as as a data guy, correlation is not always causation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like a great
Let's get
example
in.
of that. And again, I always forget which charts are in the report and which ones are
Right.
ones that like just I've made for my own interest. But it turns out that in churches that have preschools or higher schools, but that have at least a preschool, there are more child baptisms per
Makes
attendance.
sense.
So if you take child baptisms divided by attendance, there's a higher implied fertility rate, let's say, in churches that have a preschool. Okay. So which way does causality run? Is it that having a church preschool leads your church to have more child baptisms? Or is it that churches that have a lot of child baptisms, that is, that have young families, invest in keeping a preschool? Right. And that's very difficult to untangle. And so even if we found churches that have such and such a trait are growing, at 5 times the rate, that might not tell you anything about the actual effect of that trait. So like, we know that churches that have lots of young people are going to be declining less, if for no other reason than because they die less. Okay. We also know that young people, particularly young people interested in having children, tend to shift towards churches that they think are not declining. Okay. That is, people with a long time horizon tend to gravitate towards churches that they believe are going to be around for a long time. Now, this creates a huge problem, because one of the first graphs that I show, in fact, like the first several graphs that I show in the report, show that perceptions of growth in the LCMS are wildly out of sync with actual growth. That is, now I will say,
fascinating.
In the report, I focus on attendance growth. If instead I shift to like baptized membership or confirmed membership, the error is actually rather small. Okay. But my view is that like attendance is kind of what matters, because one, we care about communing communities, not lists. Secondly, a lot of churches, quite a lot of churches in the official records report 0 deaths across rather long time horizons. That is to say, they're just not filling out the death section. A lot of churches also report 0 removals across rather long time horizons. That is, they have people who are never attending and they just never remove them. Of course, the historic Christian norm before modernity would have been that if you were frequently not attending communion, you are effectively removed. In fact, that would be under the Catholic Church, that would be a mortal sin that would have to be dealt with before you could commune again. You missed communion too much. Now you can't commune. So not anymore. With modernity, we don't do these things, but okay. But regardless, so, I care about, but if you look at like confirmed membership, it's not as much of a mismatch. But what does remain true, whether you look at confirmed or baptized membership or attendance, is that who is overestimating growth is not random, right? Small LCMS churches overwhelmingly are way too pessimistic about their own experiences. Small churches are not declining as much as LCMS members think, as their own members think. It's not as bad as it looks for the small. And by that, I mean like less than 30 weekly attendance.
Less than 30. Okay.
Big churches, so like those with like over 100 weekly attendance, or especially like over 300, wildly overestimate their growth. That is, people in those churches, like half of the people in LCMS churches over 300 say that their church is growing. Okay, half of the churches over 300 people in the LCMS are not growing. In fact, there's no difference in growth rates by church size in the LCMS. There's like almost no difference. It kind of depends on how you define size and where you benchmark it, but there's very little difference by church size. It's not that big. But people in big churches believe their church is growing. And the reason is human ability to estimate numbers, our accuracy declines rapidly with group size. So it's very easy for me to tell the difference between 10 and 20 people, right? It's very difficult for me to tell the difference between 500 and 800 people. likewise, bigger churches tend to have multiple services or multiple sites. So sometimes what's going on is people are saying, well, the service I attend is getting bigger. Mm-hmm. But sometimes that's happening at the expense of other services or other sites or whatever. So all that to say, we have a serious perception gap in our church that we are overestimating growth in general. And in particular, we have a deep misunderstanding of patterns of growth in our church. The reputation of large churches as high growth churches is not correct. There's in fact now they're also not like high decline churches. Okay. There's just not a lot of difference across church size.
That's fascinating. Why? Jack, could get your take on this too. And maybe this is beyond what a demographer talks about, because you just say what is, but I'm wondering why that is that we overestimate. And when you say overestimate, you're talking more about their individual church rather than the denomination.
Yes. So
as
the
a
question
whole.
people are
That's
asked
something
is your
huge
church
to distinguish.
Growing, stable, or shrinking? Your church.
Yeah.
Or I think your congregation is what I said.
We did see a longitudinal study that kind of tracked the number of churches that exist by size, let's say over the period of a decade. I remember this report, Tim, where it did seem that the number of small churches had basically doubled over the period of, I would say, 10 to 12 years.
It was a 20-year scope. It was from study? 2002 to 2022.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, and some of that is, a lot of churches are shrinking. Churches of all sizes in the LCMS are shrinking on average. And so a lot of those, what used to be mid-sized churches are now small churches. And then you have plants, and we there is some planting work.
That's true.
And scaling a plant from, 5 members to like 20 or 25, statistically is like not that uncommon. But scaling to like 75 is much more uncommon. Because basically your kind of your social surface changes in kind of a way that's suboptimal as you start to scale beyond like 4 or 5 families, basically.
So do you have data on church planning? Did a number of new church plant and pastors fill it out? I'd be curious to know their experience.
I didn't ask. I didn't ask about plants per se, and I didn't ask about congregational age, like the time since founding. I do have data on it because I also scraped the website for all the congregational data. So like those reports that you upload, I scraped them all off the website. And so obviously like new plants are the fastest growing churches. That's not controversial, like partly because some of their growth comes from members that they are borrowing from like seed churches, so to speak. So that's like not a win. But even beyond that, they do report some elevated rates of like adult confirmations and not so much child baptisms, but adult confirmations are a bit higher in recent plants. However, when you look at like what churches are most outperforming population growth in their county, the answer tends to be quite old churches. So it does not appear that our newer plants are going to places where the people are, which is good. Okay, like I'm in favor. But like once they hit kind of a modest scale, they start to underperform local population growth pretty quickly. Whereas a lot of our older churches actually are overperforming local population trends. That is to say, they are increasing as a share of local population. In fact, if you look at this kind of a strange twist, if you look at like, so I have strong feelings about this because my father-in-law, who's close to retirement, is a pastor at a Lutheran church where he's the only LCMS pastor in quite a large radius. And it's in a county that's declining in population and has been for quite a while. And his church is about stable in size over the last 20 years, 25 years. And he's been there for 30 years. And he sometimes feels like I've been here 30 years and it's like, it looks the same as it did as when I got here. Like, it's not what you hope is going to happen when you like start your ministry. Whereas I look at it as a demographer and I'm like, brother, your county lost like 30% of its people and your church is the same. Like your share of pops, like you're like top 10% best performer in the Senate. Like you're like, this is amazing. You should write a book. And I believe his big secret is he just talks to everyone he meets at the grocery store. And like that, like this is like Kroger is fruitful ground for him. But like a lot of our fastest growing churches are actually, so to speak, like underperformers relative to local population. Right? They just are in really fast growing counties.
I'm curious to know if you've seen any change in trend with respect to people becoming formal members of the church. Because I know in our context, a lot of times in our new member class, people are coming to our class and I've been worshiping with you guys for 18 months, or 2 years. And welcome aboard, and so in a sense, they've been functioning like members of our church, right? But they've just not gone through the formal process yet, So in a sense, they may not be counted as converted, right?
Yep.
Have you seen anything like that?
Yeah. So the LCMS asks congregations to report statistics on visitors versus members. Churches that get more visitors end up having more adult confirmations as well, which is not surprising. The rate at which visitors are turned into members, you tend to have over the course of a year, you're likely to have anywhere from, in the highest performing churches, 100 visitor week butts. Okay. So like add up, if one visitor comes 50 weeks, that's 50 butts. Okay. In pews. Or if you have 50 different over the course of the year, that's 50. Okay. So on average, your highest performers, it's about one adult confirmation per 100 visitor week butts. And your lowest performers is going to be about 300. Right. So, that tends to be the conversion rate, so to speak, is that for every 1 to 300 visitor contacts that we have in our church services, right? So this is not like out in the world. Okay. But this is in our actual like weekend services that generate the numbers that we report. And this is only physical, right? So nothing online here because the official statistics are supposed to be physical only. Yeah. I think there are some churches that maybe deviated from that. But that's our typical rate is about 100 to 300 yields a confirmation. I should say churches that are, I don't have rock solid data on this, but my experience in the mission field, particularly in Montreal, we averaged for a congregation of 40 to 50 members worshiping on a Sunday. We would average about anywhere from 300 to 1,000 visitor week butts over the course of the year. Okay, that is to say, like, maybe 20, 30% of the congregation on a given week was a visitor. Yeah. That church also had much higher rates of adult confirmation than the LCMS average, like 3 times as high. Okay. The actual conversion rate of like visitors to confirmations was actually lower than the average, right? Because what was happening is we were doing lots and lots of activities to generate visitor week butts. Okay. And when you do that, you get lots more people coming, but you're kind of pulling farther and farther from the social ties that through which God tends to work. So you're dealing with people who are more weakly attached. And so they are not as prepared to receive the good gift that they're being given.
So just for my clarification, the visitor week, but if somebody visited 3 weeks in a row, that'd be 3.
That's 3.
Okay, good to know. Because I always, and for my own sake, I always think of just like names added to the database. This is a new person, first time.
No,
right?
This is, So one person coming 50, one visitor coming 50 times
Yeah.
Here's what I would say. If you have a guy coming to your church and he came 25 Sundays, I would wager you've got a 12% chance he's going to be confirmed in the next year.
Okay.
That's it.
Which is kind of low. You'd think a guy who's not a member and he comes 25 times in a year, like,
and in my mind,
like pretty high commitment.
And in my mind, that guy already thinking of himself as a member, even though he hasn't been through the class. If he's come that many times.
I regret to inform you, he is not. Now, in practice, I wish I had like true longitudinal data here. My suspicion is actually that repeat visitors, that like the effect of each additional visit on like odds of being confirmed probably rises, right?
Yeah.
I suspect that if we were to say like out of all unique visitors, what share ultimately confirmed, it's probably like an even less favorable ratio, but out of repeat visitors, it's probably, so whatever. But yeah, so all that to say that like, but I think this is important, by the way, in terms of planning plant locations. Because one of the things you have to think about, what we often think about for plant locations is like, you know, a viable building, which often means like vaguely church-ish and has parking. We think about overall geographic proximity, like commute time kind of to seed members and to sort of target community. Okay. And those are like kind of the big factors. And then also financial limitations. Okay. But in my view, probably one of the things we actually need to be thinking about is walk-in density. That is like how many people will be moving past your church sign at a sufficiently slow pace that they are likely to read it. And that basically means foot traffic. That I suspect a lot of your actual best church plant locations may be somewhat suboptimal in terms of commute time. But may actually basically be, you want places that have businesses that generate traffic. And I know like when I say generate traffic, like everybody commuting in church is like, that sounds awful. But actually like Sunday businesses are particularly good. Like you really want Sunday businesses. So like a great place to site a church would be like on the other side of the parking lot as like a mall. Okay. Probably not a strip club. I wouldn't advise that for other reasons, but that is a lot of Sunday foot traffic.
A really great breakfast restaurant, right? People go out to breakfast so like, Sunday morning.
This is like this, like you. So like our church in Montreal, where we had just vast amounts of foot traffic, was in a mostly Hindu and Muslim neighborhood. We were surrounded by restaurants on all sides. Like throw a rock in any direction and you would accidentally hit an Indian restaurant. It was great. It was like after church lunch was delicious. So I think, you know, my sense is that just kind of raw visitor density is actually probably an important factor for church plants.
So I love this study for so many reasons. One of the main reasons is it disrupts confirmation bias. And I think we're so prone to think it must look like this. And for me, one of the confirmation biases based on the traditional and missional church distinction that you say one of your data points is traditional Lutheran churches, and we can have a debate.
Sure.
This is ecclesiology, theology, et cetera, about what distinguishes traditional, missional, et cetera. Okay. It's probably more like a church that does contemporary worship, right?
Yes,
maybe a mission orientation.
That's basically what it is.
It's contemporary and traditional worship. Fine. Yeah. But that traditional Lutheran churches are being more productive at engaging those outside the church. I think for a lot of people that maybe are in circles that I run in, that's like, that's kind of wild. So I'm going to give my take. I totally see it. I think people in our culture are looking for the transcendent, the above, and traditional worship, you know, smells, bells, etc., the robes, the high church. I think if done in a accessible way, meaning the pastor is a normal guy who they can see themselves in, right? It's not the Air Pass store, but it is like, wow, we are entering into the transcendent. God is descending to us. And that's what Lutheran liturgy does at its best. It's God for us coming down through word and sacrament to remind us of who we are apart from him. And now with him, we're being liturgized or invited into the story of God in the liturgy. I believe that's very attractive today for those who are outside the church. And there's a lot of data to support that in the spiritual and not religious. I think we bridge Lutheran worship in general bridges that very, very well, and that we shouldn't just carte blanche write off everything as it relates to our tradition and our liturgy to do exactly what the mainline or non-denom churches are doing. I think that would be counter to what it means to be a confessional Lutheran in 2024 and beyond. Anything more to add to that, Lyman?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is an area that it's of course an enduring area of discussion in our synod. And it's one that I've explored in different ways in all 3 survey waves. And in this one, I would say the data got strong enough to allow me to venture less tentative conclusions. So I show like a graph that since I collected data in 2017 on congregational level worship style, let's say, and basically what it was is at the time there was a website that would like identify these are like the super, super, super traditional churches that like do things exactly this way. Okay. Great. And so that's like 10% of our congregations. So I can look at those churches in 2017 versus every other church. Okay. So we can say like, are like the super traditional churches kind of the extreme there? How are they doing compared to the rest? And the answer is since 2017, they've had appreciably less decline, whether you look at membership or attendance. And that's true even with like lots of control variables and stuff like that. And so that's interesting. But you say, well, okay, that's like kind of might be a fringe 10%, whatever. What if we look at other variables? So if that question I asked about growing or declining, it turns out the church size bias is the same whether you look at like more traditional versus less traditional Lutherans. Like for both of them, if they're in a big church, they have more biased answers, which is good for our purposes because it means even though the answers are biased, they're not biased by this like liturgical split. Okay, that's good news for us. And what we can see is that the more traditional churches are much more likely to have converts showing up in the data. So for example, I'm not doing a census of churches and then saying how many of their members are converts, right? I'm doing a survey of people and then asking them to describe their churches. But it works out similarly in that I can say, okay, so what percent of the people that say they're in these churches are XYZ? Okay. And it turns out that there are appreciably more converts in the more traditional churches than there are in the more contemporary ones. I also find I have like a series of questions I use to create an index of, I call it means prioritization. Initially, I called it sacramentarianism until a pastor told me that was actually a name of like some past heresy. And I was like, oh crap, I can't do that. I just meant as like people who really put a big emphasis on the visible means, like they talk about it a lot. They think it's a big deal. And if you start to get like, oh, well, the Spirit kind of worked on my heart, they go like, no, he didn't. He did this thing. Like, okay, like I'm just looking for like kind of like a kind of grumpy orthodox. And to be clear, like this is what I believe. Like I'm a very, my wife could attest, I'm very like stodgy, grumpy, like these are the means, they work this way. This is how it is. Okay. But I'm like looking for these people like, okay, what are there very many of them? Because they definitely, that vibe has kind of an outsized influence in like perception, intra-denominational perceptions. Okay. Very starched collar, possibly incense, and strong opinions about what to do when wine spills. Okay. But I was curious, like, who are these people? Like, am I like, because I am one of these people, so I'm like interested in sociology, we would call this me search. So it turns out that these people are, first of all, they're more likely to be converts, and like, I'm a convert. So I was like, hey, that checks out. They're more likely to be converts, particularly from more distant traditions. So like not from other Lutheran denominations, like from atheism or from Islam or from Roman Catholicism or Pentecostalism or something. Not saying Catholicism and Islam are similarly distant, just that they're all not other Lutheran denominations. They tend to be so these people, they're more likely to be converts. They're also more likely to be pastors. So pastors tend to put a bigger emphasis on this stuff than lay people do. And they are also much younger. So the average LCMS member under 30 has almost as means prioritizing opinions on this as the average pastor. Whereas the average LCMS member over 60 is like far less, quote unquote, means prioritizing than the average LCMS layperson in general. So in general, our kind of like high means prioritizing group is young and ordained. And they're also much more likely to report that their churches are growing. Which again suggests that there's growth in this more, I always wonder, we could say traditional, but then that's not quite what it means. We could say confessional, but there's debate about what that word means. Okay. Like, so this means prioritizing view is associated with convert status and congregational, less negative congregational change. So, I mean, that's pretty striking. And then finally, you were going to ask me about this in a second, but I'll just jump the gun and say, I also asked people about what factors influenced their conversion. And so I asked them, like, did you have a romantic relationship with an LCMS member before you converted? 40% of converts did. So like, we marry them in. Cyril of Jerusalem is like banging on the table, like, yes, so it has always been. If you don't get that reference, you can go look up the catechetical lectures. So, that's a big thing. But the dominant experience of conversion, like the most common reasons cited are people found in an LCMS church, they found a welcoming community that offered them something that was fresh and different from the world around them and gave them a sense of history and rootedness. So those three reasons: welcoming community, fresh and different, history and rootedness. And I think that speaks to what you're saying, Tim, right? People want like a different thing, like a little bit of mystery, maybe a little incense. We'd be okay with it. Like people want that. They understand that the I don't want to say demythologize, the world denuded of its real layer of spirit is a sad and boring place, and also a place of deception.
That describes my own conversion to
So
like every one of those points that you laid out there, I'm like, that's exactly.
So here's the interesting thing. There was an option people could check where they just said, I converted because I concluded my prior religion was false. Mm-hmm. And you might be like, well, that's obviously part of conversion. Not really. So first of all, a lot of people, they're converting from similar traditions, right? So it is just a social conversion for them because they actually didn't have to change many beliefs. Like they were coming from another Lutheran background. Like if a Wells person becomes LCMS, how much does he need to change? Like not a lot. But more importantly, we can actually see that where converts end up varies by this type of conversion they experience. And also, I should say converts of every group here have really high agreement with LCMS faith statements. In fact, converts, regardless of like their story, end up with higher agreement with like benchmark statements of LCMS belief than lifelong Lutherans do. Okay. And like, I know for myself, like my story is basically I married a Lutheran and here I am, like, I'm like, how confessional can we be? Like, let's max that. So like the fact that somebody came in one way doesn't tell you that they're like less serious about belief now. It's just some people, their conversion story is, I realized my prior belief was false. And so I went looking for something else. Other people, it's, I fell in love with a girl. And so I experienced Lutheranism and I realized it was like, great. Okay. These people both end up as faithful Orthodox believers, but their path is different. And the interesting thing is that group that said, I realized my prior religion was false and I went looking for something, overwhelmingly, that is the most typical conversion experience for converts in growing churches. Mm-hmm. The most typical conversion experience for converts in shrinking churches is romance and friendship. That is, they married someone, or they made a friend, or kind of these classic like relational evangelism ties. So growth is associated with having something that when people realize their other views are false and they go looking, they see it and they go, oh yeah, that's what I'm missing.
I wonder then how that ties into like the catechism approach to what they're doing for, you know, what they're inviting people into for new members to actually learn about the faith, to be able to actually compare and contrast from the background that they came out of. Cause that was very powerful for me going through that experience.
Yeah. I mean, I will say, and you can say if this confirms your experience or not. My experience has been a lot of this particular conversion story is I say guys because it is this group is disproportionately, it's not entirely, there are women here too, but it is somewhat more likely to be men. They often, their experience is, you know, I became really disillusioned with some prior belief. I went looking for something else. I found Lutheranism. I read the entire Book of Concord. I listened to Issues, Etc. for 6 months. I started listening to, you know, podcasts, whatever. I joined an online Bible study. And then I finally walked into a church a year later. And when they show up, they're like, I want to be baptized and confirmed. Like, now let's do this. I'm ready. And the pastor's like, who are you? Like, what? And then you go to confirmation and the guy's like, look, I've actually already memorized the small catechism. Like, awesome. Can we just like do this already? Like, you get these guys who, when they come in, like they are really, really well-versed actually in the head knowledge of Lutheranism. And my thought is like, maybe we need to think about like a 2-track adult confirmation. Like, one is like, okay, you need to learn what Lutheranism is, like doctrinally, dogmatically, didactically, catechetically. And the other one is like, okay, you read all the books. We would like you to put some roofs on widows' houses because like this is also what Lutheranism is. Like you need to be socialized. Like some people, they socialize very well. They need to be educated. Other people, they're quite educated. They need to be socialized. And I'm like, maybe we need 2 different tracks here for like, what we're working with when you come in.
Or you're so lit up, maybe we need to fast track you into some sort of leadership or teaching role and actually get you to like really, you know, lean into this thing that has gotten you so lit up in your faith, right?
Although, you know, you always worry about, there's the joke about like Calvinists go through like a cage phase, like when they convert, like they discover Reformed theology and they're like, ooh, this is so cool. And they're like really angry suddenly because apparently that's a thing. So you do get some cage phase Lutherans too, where they're like, oh, Lutheranism, You're like, like chill a little bit. You need to have the same faith as that sweet grandma over there. Like you are communing together. So like you got to find common ground. So.
Well, there are so many ways that we can go from here. I affirm that the Lutheran expression has radically evolved within the last generation. And we have 2 different extremes. And this is one of the missions of the Unite Leadership Collective, is it's a big room with lots of different people and lots of different contexts who can play in the same room, play in the same sandbox. And we may have varying behavioral tendencies given generational. So I'll make a generational statement. I think the boomer generation, by and large, because it was so centered in the church growth movement, the Jesus movement, that there are pockets in the Missouri Synod, even our congregation here, that was heavily influenced by boomer entertainment, attractional discipleship, right? And so to keep that generation, we had to kind of move in, and this is largely worship, but maybe it was social justice kind of move. We have to move beyond, right? And you have the battle over the Bible, the hierarchical method, and that generation was way kind of let's do it and serve me. And now you've got a generation, you move past kind of Gen X and millennials, Jack, you and I kind of orient in that world, and we feel like, and I'm just speaking sociologically right here, I feel like I'm arms outstretched. Okay, boomer, you need to probably repent on a number of different things, right? And you and I could go down the list there. But again, we're painting with a broad brush. We may be sold out on deep theology for attractional theology. Could some of you in that generation say that? And then on the other extreme, and this is what I hear, Lyman, you kind of pointing to, okay, brother who's 30 and now is a fast track toward one of our seminaries. If you miss on character development and having the kindness of Christ, the humility of Christ, you can go down a Pharisaical track very, very fast. So maybe that's a good way to kind of make a very general generational statement is the boomers had a stronger tendency toward hedonism, pleasure. This is in the midst of America and all the fun, do that. And then right now we see a tendency of amongst some, and maybe they're newer converts to Lutheranism toward Pharisaism. Any comments on those extremes, Lyman?
I think it's not an unreasonable general characterization. I'm always a little resistant to too general, but
sure,
but yeah, no,
sure.
I mean, I think there is some of that. Now, so so one of my personal heroes of modern Lutheranism, right? And when I say this, it's gonna be like, well, that's cheating because it's that's half our synod. Okay, Martin Franzmann, amazing dude. Okay, very top shelf hymns, some of the best ones in the LSB.
Yeah, amazing.
Also, just truly a sainted figure who is truly a blessing to our church. And I think in the final colloquy over the battle over the Bible that, and some listeners are like, who's Martin Franzmann? And my answer is go look it up. He's awesome. Okay. But he was called to try to come out of retirement, summon the old general out of retirement and have him marshal one last battle. Okay. And try to mediate a little bit of this debate. And he tried to do so and argue okay, we can talk about history. We can talk about critical reasoning about the Bible, but we're not going to set ourselves as Lord over the text. And at the end of the day, whatever you do here has to be disciplined by the fact that you have to believe all of this is true. You can talk about how it came to be historically, but you do have to believe it's true. And if you can read results of this. I think there's also recordings of this. I've just read things, it's exasperating to see how the two sides responded, right? That the historical critical side responded with just not taking the olive branch. Just no, we should be able to do all this stuff because it's very cool. And look, the good journals do it. That's basically the response. And you're oh my gosh, you were just fishing for excommunication. And then the other side turns around and rebukes Franzmann with, nowadays in internet lingo, we'd say they basically said, you don't know what time it is. You're not seeing how dire the situation is. There can't be a compromise. And I think there's some truth to that there ultimately, as we see from the direction the ELCA has gone, there really wasn't a viable long-term compromise. At the same time, now 50 years removed, you read this exchange, and what actually comes across is that there was somebody in the room trying to be an actual, in that moment, decent and upstanding and Christ-like person, and two sides of people who were kind of jerks. And not in the, I'm just saying the truth and you have to just say the truth, but willfully and very publicly unkind in a way that was unbecoming of ordained men. And the reason I say that is, Franzmann has this thing he says in one of his essays that, when someone becomes more theologically educated, their first instinct is to see all the things wrong with their church. All the things that need to be fixed. Oh my gosh, LCMS is wrong here. It's wrong here. We got to, and he's giving this lecture to a group of seminary students. Okay. And he's look, you're probably in seminary and you're thinking look at all these things that are wrong with our church now. They're not doing it right. They're doing this thing wrong, whatever. And he says, but eventually, as you grow enough, you learn to turn that critical wrath back on yourself. And you realize, oh my gosh, the reason they're doing it wrong is because they're exactly like me. And I do everything wrong. Like, I am exactly like that. And, put me up on that stage, it's like the everybody can preach a better sermon than the pastor issue, right? Like, but guess what? Ask them to preach a sermon. Oh, no, I can't do this. And I think we have some of that in our congregation, truly on both sides. And what I mean is, a sense that there is a battle within our church that needs to be fought. Sometimes because it was fun to fight the last one, or it was interesting to fight the last one. Other because we're young and it feels like we should get to have our own battle. And that the sides are defined by these groups. And one of the prior survey reports I did is show that like these sides make no sense. Like if you look at like beliefs about evangelism or beliefs about family size, fertility, they're like not correlated with like traditional or confessional or missional or contemporary. They're just not correlated. Like there are huge shares of both groups that have the things that the other group says are wrong. So we need to learn better battle lines, I think, and figure out where the actual battle is. And I don't think it's actually well described by this like confessional, missional, contemporary, traditional divide. I actually don't think that that's truly the main divide in our church. I think the main divide in our church is people who, one is people who are accurately informed about the pace at which we are numerically declining. And the reason I say that is people with more accurate assessments of what's happening to our denomination, and people who report thinking about it more frequently, also have more means emphasizing beliefs. They're more likely to engage in like inviting people to church, and they're more likely to desire having more kids. So part of this is just like a lot of people not taking seriously the challenge that our denomination is facing. And then the other big threat, I believe, is basically a kind of soft crypto-Calvinism. And that is, well, God's just going to work it all out. And yes, he will. As a Lutheran, I do believe that. But he will work it out by calling people in vocations to do things. Like, God doesn't just be like, I'm just going to toss you a pastor down from the sky. No, he raises up someone for decades of their life through education and training because they and people around them made choices to support and prioritize. And so this attitude of like, God's going to sort it out. We just got to have faith. We shouldn't worry because Jesus says not to worry. And like, yes, I understand we should not be dominated by worry, but like, it's okay to experience genuine frustration or sadness that a church you love might be half the size in 30 years. That's actually the right feeling. If you don't feel like, if you learned that something unfortunate was going to happen to someone you loved, you should feel bad about that and do something to prevent it. And I love the bride of Christ, and I think other people should too. And I think that we have a real problem in our church of one, people not accepting that the bride of Christ is standing on railroad tracks with a train fast approaching. And two, that in fact, she may need to dress herself for a wedding, that she can't just be like, okay, groom, drop the dress on, like trim your lamps. There's stuff to do.
That's good. Man, that's a great place to end the chat today. There are so many things that you said that dismiss our desire for camps. And if you're if you're a multi-generation or new convert to the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, first, I say welcome. We need you. I pray you fall in love with the Lutheran confessions, our story, the rich heritage, the liturgy. I pray that especially if you're a young person and the Lord calls you to get married, you have lots of kids and you train them up to fear and love the Lord and love their church body. And I pray that we all, no matter where our context is, we recognize there are sheep without a shepherd who are wandering in the dark and in need of the light of Jesus, and that we have that sort of evangelical fervor move into our various vocations to reach people with the gospel. Like those seem to be things we should agree on today. And then we can also agree that our church has challenges, and we should be honest about the challenges, demographic and otherwise, sociological, cultural, and maybe theological. But if we miss on identifying the problem, which is declining churches, declining leaders, if we live in kind of a fantasy land, and I love that your report says that more medium to larger size churches live in this fantasy land. I confirm that 100%, because we've kind of arrived. Well, you look at all those churches, and we kind of that's not the posture today, and so yeah, I think there's a lot that we can agree on, and I think your survey just gives us a solid footing to stand on. I pray other people take the survey. Hey, give us last kind of sneak peek. You have evolved the survey. Can you give us a sneak peek on things you'd like to survey in the next go around, Lyman?
I haven't totally decided yet. So if people have suggestions on things they'd really love to see explored, you can send them my way. An area that I did start to survey in this latest round that I may expand next time is just getting a better idea of like what's actually happening on Sunday morning. Like, even like mundane things. Like I'm kind of interested in just knowing like, like, do you go to Bible class before or after church? And like, what does that involve? Like, do you sing a hymn? Do you go from a worksheet? Like, do you read the Bible or do you read a book? Or it's like some other book or like a work. Like, what do you actually do? Like, because I hear pastors talk about like, well, Bible study this, Bible study, or like this thing, this. And I'm like, I've been in a lot of your churches. Like we go around in the summer and like raise support for missions. Like I'm in a ton of your churches. Like none of you are doing the same thing. like I don't think you all actually realize that like there's no like other than like literally like the words of institution. Like there's even people who are like, oh, I'm just doing it straight out of the LSB. I'm like, but in a very different way than the other guy doing it straight out of the LSB. Mm-hmm. So I'm interested in getting a better sense of like what's really happening there. And being able to describe that more, and have a better understanding of that. And then also I'm hoping to be able to do more partnering with churches or districts and do this thing where we can say, look, like, you're going to be part of the national survey, but then also you'll actually be able to look at like your congregational results.
So Christ Greenfield is in. I'd hope that other churches connected to the Unite Leadership Collective would be in. I don't have any kind of formal influence with the Pacific Southwest District, but President Mike Gibson, I think we ought to be in the PSD for sure to come alongside you. We need better data, and that can inform.
They can email research at LutheranLifeSurvey.church, I think is the email address. It's on the report somewhere. It's in there. And they can let me know, and later in the summer when I'm getting ready to launch, we can make it happen.
Perfect. This is Lead Time. Sharing is caring. Like, subscribe, comment wherever it is you take this in. And we promise to have great conversations where we can learn, where confirmation bias can be, that balloon can be burst a little bit. And we can get up and out of ourselves and say, hey, we can look objectively at what's going on. We can see the truth, and we can have creative conversations centered in scripture and confessions to reach people with the gospel, for the days are very, very short. I love your trim your lamps, man. Jesus is returning very, very soon. And will he find us as his church faithful to proclaiming who he is and what he's done? I pray that is exactly what he finds. It's a good day. Go make it a great day. Thanks, Lyman. You rock. Thanks, Jack. Great job as always.
Take care. God bless.
You've been listening to Lead Time, a podcast of the Unite Leadership Collective. The ULC's mission is to collaborate with the local church to discover, develop, and deploy leaders through biblical Lutheran doctrine and innovative methods. To partner with us in this gospel message, subscribe to our channel, then go to theuniteleadership.org to create your free login for exclusive material and resources, and then to explore ways in which you can sponsor an episode. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for next week's episode.